Michael Morell. Who is he? Most of our audience probably doesn't know, and nor should you really, right? He's a almost 30-year intelligence officer in the intelligence community in the United States government. During the Obama administration, he rose to the highest ranks of the CIA as acting CIA director, the man in charge of the Central Intelligence Agency. Prior to that, he was the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So he had risen to two of the most prominent seats in the entire intelligence community. What's interesting, though, is I don't believe they're coincidences, but the three data points that we're going to talk about here that involve specifically Michael Morell and the elections in the United States of America.
So it's amazing that we can go all the way back to Benghazi. This is something, a topic that kind of keeps rearing its head, like it's never been fully settled.
Yeah. As the deputy director of the CIA, Michael Morell specifically changed the intelligence presentation about the attacks on the Benghazi consulate, the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, and removed the verbiage that said Al-Qaeda had ties to it, which was the actual intelligence. That's what was happening. And then you remember the whole Susan Rice debacle where she went on the world stage and gave a news conference that was largely false. And she's been attacked for it ever since. Now, the question is, and it's been posed to Michael Morell back then, this is what, 7, 8, 9 years ago, why did you change key points of data, of intelligence? You, the deputy director of the CIA, knowing it was going to the White House to be utilized to brief the world, essentially, on what happened when a U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans were killed in Benghazi. One of the most horrific attacks in modern U.S. history on Americans. So I think some of our audience might ask, well, why would he do that? Why would he take out Al-Qaeda and any references to that? Because as you recall, Jan, and maybe some of our audience doesn't, is originally the Benghazi attacks were not styled as a terrorist attack, as it was first reported. And that's what the Obama administration wanted out there, that it was not a terrorist attack. Yet, the Obama intelligence community had absolute intelligence at the time of the reporting to show it was an Al-Qaeda related terrorist attack. And of course, it's now since been investigated, prosecuted to show just that. So why would he do that is a great question, but one that can only be answered tragically in terms of politics, because he wanted to fit a political narrative that the people in charge of the U.S. government wanted out there. And so he did it, and he shouldn't have done it.
Well, what's really fascinating about this is that you can potentially trace some of politicization of the CIA at the very least to that time.
Yeah, and it was a very consequential piece of information that would be utilized in an election. Benghazi was a significant part of that election cycle way back in 2012. Mm-hmm. So that's, I guess we'll call that Exhibit A.
Well, so now let's jump to the 2016 election, right? And so here he's writing op-eds.
Right. So Exhibit B. So now Michael Morell, to the best of my recollection, is retired from the U.S. government and writing op-eds, appearing on news shows, as a lot of former senior intelligence officials do, talking about intel, defense, and national security. And interestingly enough, he has something to say prominently about Donald Trump and whether or not he's a Russian asset. So just hit pause on that for a second. At this point in time, I think it's the summer of 2016-ish, if I have my dates right, nobody had actually labeled President Trump a Putin asset. To do so is a significant step. It's to say in U.S. intel speak that a foreign premier of Russia had recruited an American citizen running to be president of the United States and was on the Russian payroll to be an intelligence asset against America. That's what it means. Sounds crazy. Well, the former deputy director and acting CIA director, Michael Morell, at the time in the summer of 16, was the first one to prominently posit that into the mainstream media cycle before a presidential election. He literally wrote, it's likely in his experience that Donald Trump was Putin's asset. And then what happens? We've seen this narrative before, Jan. The media comes in, the mainstream media comes in and laps it up, whoever had a dislike for Donald Trump, to barrage him with the false headline that Donald Trump was somehow a Russian asset. So now you have a second interference based on false information by a former high-level intelligence officer to meddle in a presidential election. And it just happens to be the same Michael Morell. That's Exhibit B.
Well, and Exhibit C was this, again, John Solomon's, pretty bombshell reporting from a few days ago that Morell was, basically a key person in the creation of this letter that discredited the Hunter Biden laptop when the New York Post published its findings.
Yeah, it is Exhibit C. So it's interesting, Jan, if you look at Exhibit A, B to C, we have interference, meddling, all the way to election rigging. And I think, in my opinion, they're the same. It's a distinction without a difference. I don't think it was ever an escalation on his part. In his mind, he was doing the exact same thing. He wanted to influence directly the consequences of an election based on false information he put out there, utilizing his titles or former titles to sound credible in the matter. So John Solomon's great reporting is based on Chairman Jordan's work over in the House of Representatives. He basically was the one who has been leading the charge on the intel letter. The 51 intelligence officers, just to remind our audience, including a former CIA director, a former Secretary of Defense, a former NSA director, and other senior intelligence officials, Michael Morell, signed the letter 5 days after. And this is a timeline that a lot of people forget, Jan. The New York Post put out the story that Hunter Biden's laptop was being utilized to show crimes that Hunter Biden and he and the family had committed either with Russia, with Ukraine, and other adversaries. 5 days later, this letter, authored by Michael Morell and 50 other individuals, came out and said that it had the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. And it was very craftily done because immediately the mainstream media, Politico specifically, jumped on it and said, what those 51 authors wanted them to do, that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. We've heard it 1,000,001 times ever since that day. That was the objective, make no mistake about it, because these people in intel space know exactly what they're using and what words they're using and why. And they know what the mainstream media is going to do once they have a letter that's out there. So Michael Morell, you have to ask, what was his involvement in this letter? And that's what Jim Jordan was getting to the bottom of. And he found out that Michael Morell had been contacted by then Biden campaign advisor Tony Blinken, who is now the Secretary of State for Joe Biden. Michael Morell came in and testified under oath to the House Judiciary Committee that Jim Jordan is chairing. And he was specifically asked, Michael Morell, was specifically asked by either a member of Congress or staffer under oath, what triggered you to do the 51 intel letter, as we call it? And he said, Tony Blinken. So now we have learned that Tony Blinken and Michael Morell were communicating at the time of the campaign, and Tony Blinken basically gave him one of these, wonderful Washington handshakes, as you call them, to say, oh, hey, I'm not asking you to do this, but, it'd be good if we had a narrative out there to run against the New York Post reporting. So, of course, Tony Blinken's going to go out there and say, well, I never asked him to do this, but it's curious, Jan, that you have the former acting Central Intelligence Agency Director, Michael Morell, under oath saying it was Tony Blinken who triggered him to author the letter with 51 intelligence officials and to get it out with such speed and alacrity. So now I have a whole host of other questions, but staying on Michael Morell, why did this guy do it not once, not twice, but 3 times? Well, Jim Jordan asked him, or his staff asked him under oath, specifically, why did you, Michael Morell, the former acting CIA director, write this letter knowing it to be false? That was another admission. He knew it was not Russian disinformation. And he said because simply he wanted Joe Biden to win. That is the very definition of election rigging. And when we talked about it on this show and this great network and so many other media outlets, we were called the conspiracy theorists. We were called the liars. We were called the libelous, defamatory authors. And it turns out we were always, as we always do, reporting the truth. And Michael Morell has now been exposed.